I'm Holly Ludgate from the NMC. Were you able to make our second On the Horizon series event for big data? If not, have no fear. This is a full archive with recap of highlights for you to view. On November 13th, Dr. Ruben Pentadura from Hippasus moderated a panel discussion with K-12 Higher Ed, Museum, and Library about big data. First, we have Aaron Bartlow from Syracuse University, School of Information Studies. From the K-12 world, we have David Baxter, representing the Blake School. Next, we had Nicole Stussman-Forbes from the Dallas Museum of Art. We had Jeffrey Gumpf from Case Western Reserve University. We had Jill Hurst-Wheel from Syracuse University. The conversations revolved around 5 main questions, as well as questions brought up by our on-the-air participants, our audience members. First, we defined big data in each of the panelists' environment.
The 3 V's, the volume or how much data there is, the velocity and how quickly data is growing, and lastly, the variety of data or how complex the data sources are. But if I had to pick one, as misleading as the word big can be, it isn't just the volume, it really is the variety or the complexity of the data that makes it big data.
Then we looked at examples of big data in each of the panelists' environments.
There is in a DNA strand something like 3.2 billion pairs of nucleotides, and scientists are struggling to figure out what this means to us. And so big data is certainly a player here, along with all the data science and analytics associated with it, in helping them to discover the functionality of our DNA.
We then look to discuss a few of the tools that are being used in big data and data collection.
I like examples that are very personal to me, and so I think about my shopping on Amazon.com, the fact that Amazon is collecting my data, but data from thousands of other people, and then being able to predict for me the things I might like based on my likes and the likes of other people. And so I think that's an example that doesn't seem so big because of how personal it is, but if you recognize what's going on behind the scenes, that's the outgrowth of big data.
This was followed by answering the important question, what is the next opportunity for big data?
So I think of like the work that is happening out of the HP Catalyst Academy and the STEMX MOOCs. And how could you, this is sort of like a very much pie in the sky idea, but how could you mash what teachers are doing in those MOOCs with what students are engaging in using tools like gizmos and virtual manipulatives or other math-based programs to create sort of like a STEMX learning profile, right? So like, what is this intersection between the pedagogy and how the big data can help us improve our pedagogy, but how can students have a real opportunity to engage in more personalized learning journeys?
And we closed out with, what are the challenges with privacy surrounding big data?
We're thinking carefully about that in terms of privacy policies, and we don't do any automatic tracking. To go back to kind of when I mentioned my concrete example is that people are opting into this. They only tell us what they want us to know, what they're doing or when they're doing it in the museum.
Check out the following complete presentation addressing K-12 museums, higher ed, and libraries, and all of the things that surround big data, even who actually owns that data. Good afternoon. We are delighted to welcome you to the second session of NMC's On the Horizon. The NMC On the Horizon series reflects the research and work of the NMC Horizon Project in action. In these Google Hangouts on Air, international panelists of experts are convened across all education sectors to address the emerging technologies poised to significantly impact teaching and learning. In today's one-hour hangout, Dr. Ruben Pentadura, founder and president of Hippasus, educational consulting firm focusing on transformative applications of information technologies to education, will moderate this live panel discussion on big data. I am your host today, Holly Ledgate, the Senior Director of Program Development for the NMC. We also have Amy Blake today joining us for the technical support side, as well as Alex Freeman. If at any point you have any problems, please feel free to chat with her and she can certainly help you. So sit back, get comfortable, and enjoy the following discussion. But first, a bit of logistics. In this session, if you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A area, and you can also +1 a question that you are interested in having answered. We will be collecting your questions throughout the session, and our panelists will be tackling these throughout and at the end of the session. Also, if you are on Twitter today, be sure to use our hashtag NMCHZ to keep the conversation going on this topic. Now, on to the moderator of today's webinar. Dr. Pentadura has been working 18 years in educational research and reform. While a teaching fellow for Harvard University, he's co-developed new courses in introductory sciences aimed at increasing the breadth and depth of science understanding for majors and non-majors alike. This work resulted in a Pi Beta Kappa Teaching Award, as well as in being named Harvard's Technology Fellow. Over the next 12 years, as a faculty member at Bennington College and as the director of the college's New Media Center, Dr. Pentadura designed and implemented new models for teaching that made exemplary use of new media and networking technologies. Dr. Pentadura is best known for his SAMR model, a method of seeing how computer technology might impact teaching and learning. The list goes on and on for this great work this man has done, but we are also lucky enough to have him on the NMC Board of Directors. So please take it away, Dr. Pentadura.
Thank you, Holly. Well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad all of you could join us. What I want to talk with you about today, or rather act as moderator to help others present their views on this today, is the topic of big data. So without further ado, what I would like to do is now offer an opportunity for each of our panelists to introduce themselves. So perhaps, David, if you could go first and let people know a little bit more about who you are and what it is you do.
Sure. I'm David Baxter. I serve as a Director of Information Support Services in a pre-K through 12 school in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the Blake School. I work with our faculty, our technology specialists, engineering programming faculty, and our teacher librarians, working with a wonderful group of students.
Great. Thank you. Erin, if you could go next.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Erin Bartolo. I work with the Syracuse University School of Information Studies, or iSchool. And in that role, I help educate people on the use of big data and data science. And I work with students across the life cycle, from when they're prospective students to current students, all the way through alumni and employers.
Thank you. Wonderful. Jeffrey?
Hi, I'm Jeff Jump. I am the Chief IT Architect at Case Western Reserve University. I look at how new technology impacts the IT ecosystem here at the university and work with our faculty, staff, and students to find new ways to bring IT into the system.
Wonderful. Thank you. Jill?
Hi, I'm Jill Hurst-Wall. I'm Director of the LIS and School Media Programs here at Syracuse University, and in my role I also work with Erin to oversee our Certificate of Advanced Studies in Data Science.
Wonderful. And Nicole?
Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Stutzman-Forbes, the Chair of Learning Initiatives and the Director of Education at the Dallas Museum of Art. And I oversee a great team of about 20 full-time educators who work with me to think carefully about the experiences of our visitors and making powerful, meaningful connections with works of art happen.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for being here today. As I said, the topic for today is big data. And what I'd like to do is set the stage a little bit more by saying, well, what were we looking at big data as being back in the 80s? And, you know, when we looked at big data in the 80s, we were talking about the use of the national supercomputing centers, which were then established to look at things like data coming in from NASA. And maybe big oil companies were looking at big data. But today, big data has become much more democratized, much more used across a very broad range of applications throughout academia, throughout libraries, throughout the world of museums. So perhaps we should start off by having each of you give a brief definition of what big data is in your world. So, Nicole, would you like to start perhaps?
So basically, big data for the DMA right now is a high volume data set that is really recording and capturing participation and engagement of our visitors. So we are an informal learning institution interested in repeat visitation experiences of our visitors. So we're looking at high volume data sets to see what we can learn about those experiences that are captured, what that can illuminate about our visitors, and how that can help us do our work better.
Wonderful. Thank you. That begins to give us a bigger picture. Jill, would you like to say what big data looks like in your world?
So for me, I definitely think about the volume and the variety of big data. And one of the examples I use is thinking about libraries and their communities and the amount of data that you can get from the community in terms of demographic information, merging that with maps, merging it with information on services, information that's coming from the library itself, and creating a more interesting picture of who's using services, how they are using them, and what the needs are in the community. So again, the key for me is volume of data, and then that complexity, that kind of mashing of data together into something that tells a story.
Excellent. Again, I think people will start to see how this picture is beginning to, round out, look much richer than what we were looking at in the 80s. David, your thoughts?
So for me, at the K through 12 level, I think of big data specifically for young students to give some opportunities for personalization of learning, for differentiation of learning, for flexibility of learning. So to especially for students to be thinking about what their learning profile is and what they're motivated to do, what they're interested in learning in, and then having a variety of means in which to engage with different disciplines or different epistemologies, different ways of understanding ideas.
Wonderful. Erin, what does it look like from your perspective?
Yes, well, as Jill mentioned, the 3 V's, the volume or how much data there is, the velocity and how quickly data is growing, and lastly, the variety of data or how complex the data sources are. But if I had to pick one, as misleading as the word big can be, it isn't just the volume, it really is the variety or the complexity of the data that makes it big data.
Excellent. So we're looking at a profile then where it's not just a lot of number, but as you say, the complexity. There's a certain richness, a certain texture to it. Jeffrey, how do you see it? Do you also have that type of a perspective on big data?
Yes. In higher education, big data plays a role in a variety of areas. Certainly in the research community, if you think about things like genomics or proteomics, computational biology, artificial intelligence, various engineering disciplines, it certainly plays a role in science. In fact, modern science is moving from the wet labs to these data sciences and digital technologies. From the teaching and student side of the house, learning analytics plays a big role in helping us understand how our methodologies for teaching students and helping them learn are working. And student retention is also a big issue in higher education, where most universities are highly interested in making their students successful and make their large investment in education worthwhile. I noticed there's a question over here on the side about does anyone know of any schools, courses, MOOCs that offer good insight on big data and its uses in education? Actually, on Coursera right now, Ryan Baker from the Teachers College at Columbia University in New York is offering a course on big data in education, and I'm taking that course, and it's really quite good.
Wonderful, excellent. So that's a resource. When everybody is done here today, go out and sign up for the course. That's absolutely great. So Jeffrey, I've got you then on screen. Can you follow that up a little bit? I mean, you've given a very broad panorama. Again, can we make it concrete? Can you give us one example? If you had to pick one example that you really stands out in your mind for big data in your world, what would you pick?
Well, certainly right now, that's in areas of medicine, such as genomics and proteomics, helping people understand the functionality of our DNA. There is, in a DNA strand, something like 3.2 billion pairs of nucleotides, and scientists are struggling to figure out what this means to us. And so big data is certainly a player here, along with all the data science and analytics associated with it, in helping them to discover the functionality of our DNA.
Okay, excellent. And I noticed that Jim Benitez has posted a question about concrete examples of how volume, velocity, and variety come together. So I think that you've already spoken some to that. Perhaps, Nicole, if you could address now again a little bit more detail, flesh out a little bit more, what a concrete example looks like in your arena.
Sure. So first of all, big data has kind of been a part of the world at the DMA since January of this year. At that time, we launched a digital platform or program called DMA Friends, which is a free membership, basically. An opt-in program for our visitors to sign up, and then as they're participating in a variety of museum activities and programming, which are structured within this digital platform, they can check into spaces in the museum, they can check into activities and programs that are going on. So since January, we've had 36,000 people opt into this program. And an example, something kind of diving a little bit deeper for us, and we certainly are kind of figuring things out as we go because it's young in our world in terms of big data. But one day, for example, one of the activities that people can participate in and check in is loving a work of art in our collection. And the data that we're receiving, looking in particular at one day, had over 2,000 different check-ins of loving a work of art, and in addition to checking in, they told us which accession numbers, which works of art they were loving. So that's 1,000 lines in an Excel sheet of information that we have about kind of people beginning to connect with works of art, and opportunities for us to dive even deeper in terms of how are they connecting with those particular works of art, and what does that mean in terms of the work that we're doing as educators.
Excellent. Thank you. Looking again a little bit in the questions, I noticed that Matthew is also talking about the tools used to analyze big data and would like to know a little bit more about that. Perhaps, Jill, if you could talk a little bit more about an example in your area and some of the tools you might be using these days.
So I have a couple of stock examples that I give. One is using Amazon. I like examples that are very personal to me, and so I think about my shopping on Amazon.com, the fact that Amazon is collecting my data, but data from thousands of other people, and then being able to predict for me the things I might like based on my likes and the likes of other people. And so I think that's an example that doesn't seem so big because of how personal it is, but if you recognize what's going on behind the scenes, that's the outgrowth of big data. Another one that I think is very timely is if you think about what's going on in the Philippines or in any natural disaster, and the fact that the response is the marriage of many different types of data. So looking at weather patterns, weather history, wind speeds, currents, then thinking about where materials are, food, water, those types of things in the world that can be brought to bear on the situation. Those are all seemingly little pieces of data that come together to paint a big picture and that allow responders to predict where they need to be, how much they need to get there, all those things that will hopefully make things better in the long run. And then the third example is one that just came to me today as I was warming up for this session. I watched a TED Talk, a gentleman talking about his phone records. He's in Germany, and he got 6 months of his phone records and the stories that those phone records told of all the phone data that the company was keeping on him. And you might think of that as an evil or perhaps a benefit, but that's a real outgrowth of big data in knowing how a person moves through their lives and then being able to kind of predict what they might do or where they might go next.
Thank you. No, those are good examples. And I think, in terms of some of the tools, you actually pointed in two different directions, right? On the one hand, you have the recommendation systems, like those used by Amazon or, say, Netflix, in terms of an automated on-the-fly analysis of the data, doing a pattern matching approach to big data, say, well, what patterns match what you like? And the other example you've got is of an extension of what we used to call the traditional GIS systems, for geographic information systems, although to be perfectly frank, some of these have expanded so hugely that they almost need a new label of their own. So thank you. I think those are great examples.
And let me just interject that the software being used can vary widely in terms of analyzing data. So people talk about R and these more modern scripting languages, but when you go back to the 1980s, we're talking SAS and SPSS and mainframe systems, and those things all still exist. So there's a variety of different tools that are being used to analyze big data.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. So, Erin, thoughts from your area for an example in a different type, perhaps?
Sure, absolutely. Well, there are so many different ways to use big data and so many examples. Sometimes it's hard to narrow it down, but one of my favorite is really interactive at the user end, and that's using social media data and combining it with transactional data. So this is really big in the world of commerce or in business. For retail, they're combining the virtual worlds and the your physical world as well. So for instance, if you're going by a store and you're tweeting out some message about it, even if you're not using a certain hashtag, you can owners can do different sentiment analyses or different types of looks at the data that's out there about them, and then they can respond in real time, whether it's a one-on-one consumer interaction or even aggregating different data and doing some type of marketing response, whether it's a sale or some type of in real-time promotion. So I think that's one of my favorite because we're all in some way consumers, and there's a really interactive component to that. I do want to follow up on a former question as well, if you don't mind, and that's about the tools. Jill mentioned the tool R, which is a statistical program for analysis. That's a really great place to start. In fact, we have a MOOC going at Syracuse University's iSchool. It's a self-paced MOOC. There aren't any starting or ending dates or deadlines, so no constraints. And you can make your way through it at your own leisure, or you can even just go in, take a look, and bail out, depending on what your priorities are. But I'd be happy to talk to anybody more about that as well.
Well, thank you, Erin. Again, that's a great resource. And since we're on the topic of R, let me throw in a quick resource here as well. I've been a participant in the Strata conference, which is organized by O'Reilly, and I found that many of the resources associated with the conference, papers, presentations, etc., tutorials, are also great for learning more about R or the uses, for instance, of Python as a programming language to analyze data, particularly when you integrate with tools like R. So again, that's another resource I think people might find useful. David, you have a somewhat different set of uses for your data than the rest of the group, so I'm curious to hear what you would pick out as an example in your world.
Well, like Jill, I agree. I think it's helpful to think about ways that we are already engaging with big data as we sort of walk this journey together. So just on the way to work today, I use an app on my iPhone called Waze. Waze is a GPS mapping solution, and what it is, as Aaron was talking about, is it has some sort of like social media gaming component to it, where the Waze participants, folks who've opted in, are sharing information about what's happening on the roads in the Twin Cities. And so for me personally, it's helped me save hours of my life so that I can be with family and friends. So I think that's a really good example of big data. Or now seeing something like Google Now, which will preempt me with combining my data from my Google Calendar and my Gmail and my GPS and transactional data to preempt me and say, hey, are you doing this, or are you heading in this direction, or shouldn't you be calling this person? So almost an automated personal assistant to that is based on big data. In terms of the K through 12 space, I would say it's really interesting right now because, as I was mentioning earlier, I think we're sort of at the cusp of seeing how big data might provide opportunities for students to engage in more personalized learning opportunities. And so, for example, a couple of software service solutions that are using big data. One that we're using right now is a self-report survey instrument by a company called Bright Bytes named Clarity. And this instrument is trying to look at how to measure students' engagement with technology use at home and at school, and trying to give a more connected learning profile. And they're a young company. I think they have about 5 million students and faculty are participating in this. And so what they're trying to do is help both within the institution, as well as the institution measuring itself over time, as well as measuring against other institutions, different aspects of how we're engaged with technology for learning. And then the other aspect that I'm really interested in is the notion of the New York City School of One idea of using tools like ST Math or Dreambox to engage students in something that's very concrete, like learning math, and different ways of engaging it in that discipline, and having enough data, enough predictive factors that the data itself, the way that students are engaging with it, adapts to what they might need more reinforcement in, or sort of how they can move ahead of the class. So this idea of flexibility around what learners are using. And so those are some concrete examples, both in my personal life and my professional life. And then one plug, and I don't know if this would fall into the tools, but I was fortunate to grow up with a gentleman by the name of Ben Fry, who helped co-develop the processing language. And the processing language, and I'm not a computer scientist, I'm not a data scientist, but to me, some of the work that I've seen come out of it is help visualize big data. So a lot of really interesting works in the humanities of taking, as Jill was mentioning earlier, huge volumes of books, of data, and really trying to look at the trends of when the idea of words come into play in language, or the idea of how ideas are represented. So one of the tools that I'm not sophisticated enough to use, but it seems very promising, is the processing language.
Excellent.
And I just want to pop in and say that we had students, graduate students last spring, in a data visualization or information visualization class, and it was interesting to see them visualize sentiments from books and other things that really make the works come alive in a different way. And so one student visualized a sentiment from several books, and thought this one book was going to be positive, but when you started looking at the words and the text and mapping it, it wasn't as positive a book in sentiment as what she had thought.
Right. And again, that's a wonderful area. I've seen some recent studies also published. There are now several groups building up big data corpuses of words, terminology, etc., that can be used for this analysis. And again, it's a beautiful alternative path in terms of how you get into some text. So, thank you. I think that's again a wonderful example for people who think in the bigger picture of big data. And Jill, so while I have you on screen, then if you had to summarize just one or two sentences. If you had to say, okay, you've told us what the definition, what an example is, what do you see if you had to pick the big opportunity you see going forward? What's that look like?
I think the big opportunity is really using data to get to know our communities better. And so mining the data that already exists about our communities, merging that, marrying it, mashing it up with other data that will present us with new patterns. So we all think we know our communities. We're all convinced that we know our communities. But if we looked at the data, would we see something different? And I think that's something that would help us understand communities that aren't visible in our cities, immigrant communities, other communities that don't necessarily cross our paths every day. And so I think for me that's an area that is really ripe to go after.
Excellent. Thank you. That's great. Jeffrey, what would you say are the big opportunity, the core opportunity you would see from your perspective?
I would say that one of the core opportunities is to make the community aware of the power that data science and the data analytics can bring to solving problems. I don't think people have a really good understanding of how powerful these tools really are. And I think making more people aware and letting them learn how how data science can be used to address significant problems that they're facing. I know in our community you don't hear the terms very much, and I think it's worthwhile getting that word out there and getting a hold of these data scientists that are coming out of various programs, such as the ones mentioned here today by Syracuse, to help these offices and various parts of the institution understand how they can use data that they already have available to help them solve problems.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So, Erin, what will you identify as the core opportunity that?
Yeah. Well, again, there are so many opportunities, but to narrow it down, I'm a big believer that there's always a cause that we're going after. A lot of us on the panel and those of you participating today, there's probably been something that at some point you went up to bat for and your heart was behind it and you knew you were right on it, but you just weren't able to convince the deciding party to go your way. And that can be a really crushing experience, especially when you know the stakes are really high. So Jill and I sometimes say that data has your back. So I think that looking at big data, or even just any data, as your ally, as your evidence, and as she talked about a little bit, as a way to tell your story, it's a great way to have somebody in your corner, in this case something in your corner, to prove your point or to be able to really show evidence that something either needs to change or the status quo isn't working, or even just that little spark to get someone to pilot out your idea. Having data behind your argument might help push that over the edge. And I do emphasize it doesn't have to be big data. It can be small data. It can be a little bit of data. But I think that real shift that we're looking at toward being more data-driven in our decision making, I think it's going to have a really powerful impact, especially when we combine it with some of the domain expertise that people have under their belt.
Excellent. Thank you. David, you've mentioned, of course, the Bright Bytes software and a couple of other tools that you're already using. So do you see an opportunity for a tool that doesn't exist yet, or a tool you'd like to see exist in your world?
That's a great question, Ruben. So one of the challenges in the K-12 space, and there are a couple of folks who are trying to take a whack at this, is all of these are really siloed in many ways. All this big data, if you will, is siloed. And so as Jill is pointing out, how do you pull this data from all these different silos to really create more robust learning profiles? So I think one of the things that I think is an opportunity is this idea of creating open APIs that different niche organizations could share with one another and more importantly, share with students and teachers and schools as a way to really develop a more comprehensive learning profile. So I think of like the work that is happening out of the HP Catalyst Academy and the STEMX MOOCs, and how could you, this is sort of like a very much pie in the sky idea, but how could you mash what teachers are doing in those MOOCs with what students are engaging in using tools like gizmos and virtual manipulatives or other math-based programs to create sort of like a STEMX learning profile, right? So like, what is this intersection between the pedagogy and how the big data can help us improve our pedagogy, but how can students have a real opportunity to engage in more personalized learning journeys? That's what I see as the big opportunity for someone to solve.
Excellent. And by the way, I agree. I think that's a great opportunity. And if anybody's listening to this discussion today and says, hey, I have a company that would like to leap into that field, by all means do so, because I think there's really some incredible potential there. Nicole, I noticed looking in the sidebar that we have a question that I think relates to this question of opportunities. Dana is asking what you're planning on doing with the data. So perhaps, Nicole, if you could talk a little bit more about the data, the opportunities that opens up to you. And then I would like to bring in one more thing, perhaps, for us to start thinking about that has already come in, which is what are the challenges? And in particular, I want to talk about privacy and big data. So perhaps if you would address that.
All right. So I think when I think about, to address Dana's question a little bit, but also address the question of core opportunities, I think there's sort of a local way that we're looking at opportunities, as well as something that expands a little bit bigger than that at the DMA. Certainly going back to what Jill kind of started this question with, I think it is about, for us at the DMA, it's about knowing our audiences better, and to also kind of relate to what David was saying, personalizing, providing a framework to begin to kind of personalize their experiences or customize those experiences and recognize who communities are and how they can be identified by a great variety of factors, backgrounds, experiences, interests, motivations, things like that. I think a big opportunity that we're experiencing at the DMA also is a great opportunity internally for our staff to kind of build capacity as far as thinking in new ways about how we do our work every day, how data in this kind of, with this complexity and volume, begins to maybe just tweak the way that we think about doing things a little bit differently. I don't know that we feel that we have big problems to solve, but I think museums move pretty slow. We're not always nimble players in terms of the learning experiences that we design or in general, and I think the data has the potential to begin to tell us more about the things that we're doing that maybe are working well, the things that maybe we should stop doing, to echo one of Erin's points in her comments as well, and make some changes as far as the experiences that visitors can have in our space. A couple of other things just related to core opportunities that relate to some things that were brought up are also that the tool that we're using, DMA Friends, this digital platform that we have, which is a badge stack OS system that works out of WordPress, and there's obviously a back end for us at the museum as well as a visitor front end for that, but that's an open source tool that we're planning to share with several other museums, and we're getting ready to actually launch a project with art museums in Denver, Los Angeles, and Minneapolis, so that they're building up data sets as well, and we can kind of do this comparison and contrasting across different areas of the country. And also compare what it is that we do. Educators at the DMA aren't working exactly like what educators at Denver are doing, or what they're doing in Los Angeles, or what they're doing in Minneapolis. So that's a really exciting kind of project for us on the horizon. And I think that museums talk a lot about engagement, but we don't have all of the backup on that to kind of, or the evidence to sort of say this is what we mean by that, or this is evidence of what's really happening in terms of experiences. And I think that will help us clarify the impact and the value of museums and what they can do for communities. To come back, well, would you like me to pause? I've been talking.
Well, no, I think I think this is a perfect moment to segue into the question then of privacy. So again.
Okay, so for privacy, the way that we've kind of addressed that at the DMA is launching into this program. We really retooled and looked at our privacy policies and a variety of aspects of those. And as I mentioned, this is an opt-in program, so there's an interface system on iPads when visitors come into the museum, and they're presented with the privacy policy that they have to accept before they're actually fully signed up and checked into this particular project. And we're committed to protecting the individual privacy of our users in ways. We do work with a third party. Chartio is sort of a system that we use, a third party that we use to analyze some of our data that comes out in a very readable form for someone like me who is not a data scientist. And making sense of that information. And if we were going to kind of get more specific and run individual data, we have ways of connecting with our friends. When they sign up for the program, they are required to give us either a phone number or an email address. They can opt out of communications with us. Our Friends program is only for 13 years and above in terms of visitors. So we're thinking carefully about that in terms of privacy policies, and we don't do any automatic tracking. To go back to kind of when I mentioned my concrete example is that people are opting into this. They only tell us what they want us to know, what they're doing or when they're doing it in the museum.
Excellent, thank you. That I think starts to set, I think, some of the key pieces in place for a discussion. Jill, you had mentioned earlier the example of the talk you heard in that context. Something from your own personal experience or personal world that you'd like to elaborate on for the privacy angle?
Oh, for me, the privacy is a huge concern because in order to get that personal service that we all want, so that's kind of the outgrowth of big data, is that you put all this information out there in a variety of different ways, and personal service, personal offers, whatever that might be in terms of coupons or recommendations flow back at you. But in order to do that, you have to give up part of your privacy. And for me, that's a huge concern because I believe, and you might be able to prove me wrong, that most people don't recognize how much they're giving away. And so people give away a lot of their privacy in order to get that personal service, but oftentimes we give up too much of our privacy, and so there's that real balance between giving up enough for personal service, personalization, and giving up too much that could lead to having your identity stolen or something else. And I think as a industry, or we're not really a formal industry in data science, but as this huge or mass of people thinking about it, we need to figure out a balance between those two things. How do you have enough data to give people what they want, but protect them from the evils that could happen because you've taken too much data? This occurs in medicine, where the more you can give over of your data, the better medicine can predict your future, but that prediction may not be used in a way that you'd like. And so again, having that balance of what you give over and then ensuring that's used the right way.
Excellent, thank you. David, I'm curious, how are you handling the privacy question with your students? How is that being managed?
Well, I think one of the things that we do, and it was great to hear how much Nicole and her team are doing, is to do a lot of similar techniques, right? So we provide opt-out policies for our families. We try to be as rigorous as we can with any third party about how the data is stored, how it is secured. The notion of the difference between anonymous data, how long the data will exist, who owns the data. So these are all really challenging questions, and they take deep dives with each and every company because unfortunately there's not it would be great if someone came up with, again, a sort of pie in the sky idea, but if Lawrence Lessig or someone came along with a Creative Commons for big data privacy, right? So like a real clear licensing structure for how the data is used. And I think one of the challenges, and there was a great, if I recall correctly, a great article in the New York Times maybe a month ago about a superintendent who was encountering a fair amount of backlash from families because she was working with a company called InBloom that is trying to sort of create these learning profiles for teachers about their students, and families not really being brought into the conversation early on. So I think just from just a communication tactical point of view, it's really important to make sure that it's clear how the data is being used, and all sort of the other ways I was mentioning before. But I think this is again an area that for just the sake of ensuring it is used ethically is sort of an opportunity. I mean, one thing that I would love to see all companies provide is not only an opt-out, but a true promise of a data wipe, right? So that, I decide I do love my Google Now predictor, but maybe a year from now I decide, this is a little insidious, I feel a little too Orwellian. There should be really a button at the bottom of every Google Now note that says, would you like to remove all of your data from Google? And I guarantee that they'll do that, because I think that's the only way that we'll ever be able to build trust in the notion of the democratization of data, especially when it comes to areas of commerce.
That's a very good point. Jeffrey, you deal with a very different student population. What does it look like in your world in terms of what you deal with privacy and associated issues?
Well, certainly as a research university, we have a lot of familiarity with handling very carefully personal and private information. Any type of research that involves, humans typically has to go through a process with an IRB to ensure that, the people involved in the research have agreed to let their data be used, and that the data will be protected. And I would say in general with data science, one of the powers of data science is to find obscure relationships between data. And this is what makes it so onerous from a privacy standpoint. There's a famous example of a number of years ago where America Online released a data set of search that was supposedly de-identified so that people wouldn't be able to figure out who did what kind of searches, and it wasn't more than a few weeks that some people at the New York Times were able to identify specific individuals, and so I think great care must be exercised when using these tools, and a high standard of ethics employed.
No, thank you, and I agree, and I think the role of IRBs, again, is important and be evolving as this moves forward. Aaron, from your perspective as a data scientist, I'm curious perhaps to see if you have any additional thoughts on some of the, shall we say, software approaches that can be taken, some of the data analysis approaches that can be taken to preserve privacy?
Sure. Well, I think when I think about privacy, I'm more adept in speaking at it at more of a conceptual level, and David raised a couple points that kind of come up for me, and that's the idea of portability and ownership of data. So a lot of times we hear about privacy, but the idea of your data being portable, so that just because you've consented to releasing it at one point doesn't mean it's out of your hands for eternity and it belongs to some third party, or the idea of who actually owns that data, because if you can imagine a garbage truck filled with garbage, and all that output, human output, that's just, we consider it waste. If we compare that to data and think about how much data output or data exhaust is happening right now, and how little the people creating or generating that data realize of its value. I could see the idea of ownership. Who owns what used to be garbage when you realized it's filled with insight and it's filled with opportunity? Who actually owns that? And to date, I don't know that anyone has been able to claim any data as an asset, for their companies, but they're certainly profiting from data when they know how to work with it properly, they know how to mine it, they know how to analyze it. So in terms of privacy, what really interests me is the idea of your data being portable and the idea of being able to take ownership of your own data. And to date, I think the tides are going in one direction, and that's away from the person producing the data as the owner, as the one who can keep it, keep that portability.
Thank you. And again, I think that the issue of the ownership and how to, so we say, assert the ownership so it becomes more than theoretical ownership is indeed a crucial one. Are there specific tools, perhaps, that you could reference here in terms of, ways of, say, sharing some data but retaining ownership of other data that you could refer?
That's a good question. I wish that I had a good answer for that. Unfortunately, I don't. Most of the cases that I've seen, not here at the university, but just in general as I work with big data and other organizations' use of it, like I said, it tends to be kind of an output of data. So once it's released, it's released. But I would be interested in learning more about it. It sounds like it could be its own topic, actually.
Good point. All right. Thank you. So perhaps what I'd like to do now, as we're getting close to the end of our session, is to give each of you an opportunity to perhaps build out a little bit on something you've already touched on or something that you feel we haven't covered yet. And also, take a look at the sidebar for questions that you might feel that you could address or answer. So, Erin, since you're on screen, again, would you like to go forward with this?
Sure, absolutely. Well, over the next 5 to 10 years, as the tools become more and more sophisticated, I really see the direction of working with big data as being something that we can all do. So just like most of us are able to open up an Excel spreadsheet, and we might not be wizards, but we can hold our own, I see the tools that are really highly complex and require a lot of special expertise to even work with. I see those as becoming more sophisticated and open to the free market, whether you're a data scientist or not. So when that happens, I think the key role or characteristic that will really matter is that data-driven decision-making ability that I mentioned before, and the ability to know what data tells the right story, to be able to look at the data objectively, but also not to make knee-jerk reactions and say, the data says this, therefore we're changing course and doing that. So there's got to be this constant struggle with working with data, but also not looking at it blindly. And it takes a lot of perseverance and curiosity and kind of a love of data to be able to have that relationship with it, because as much as there's a lot of promise with working with big data or any type of data, it is, even once you have the data in front of you, you still have to make some pretty tough decisions. And anybody who works within an organization knows there aren't many simple decisions nowadays. So I think that idea of developing your ability to be data-driven, developing your ability to be curious and want to know more about, as Jill referenced, your community or whatever party you're looking into, I think that's going to be the real key, because the tools will continue to change and evolve and eventually be more of mass market appeal, where you don't need those specialized skills to use them for analysis.
Well, thank you. I think, again, as you're saying, the evolution of the tools is quite important. This is, I don't even have to go back to the 80s for this. Even as recently as 5 to 10 years ago, the tools were much more complex and much more difficult to work with. And I think that we've seen that evolution be very positive indeed. Nicole, thoughts on something you'd like to expand or perhaps address a question from the sidebar?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll take a stab at attempting to kind of address Jim's question, which has a lot of pluses on it. And probably the first stab I'll take at this is to say that, I do really feel like we are in the thick of kind of this data that's coming into us in terms of the personalized experiences. And what we've built, where we are right now, is what we've built is a platform really for participation and engagement. And I think we can find information in terms of personalizing more information about who our communities are, who our audiences are, that can begin to help us personalize their experiences in the museum. A concrete example of this, I don't think it's an in-depth example of this, but to know that a certain number of our friends have checked into contemporary art galleries, and being able to offer them an opportunity of participation or experience that is in addition to just the normal everyday experience, visiting a private gallery, and communicating with them in a way that kind of personalizes or recognizes that they have an interest in a particular area. I think what we'd love to get to is this idea of learning, for sure. That's one of our ultimate outcomes in terms of experiences at the museum. There are other outcomes that we're interested in as well. And for us, thinking that participation and engagement is on the right path towards learning and in-depth experiences. But I also think that related to that, a part of what we're asking ourselves is, sorry, my computer just did something a little bit crazy. There we go. A part of what we're asking ourselves is sort of both the relationship of this big data, which is very quantitative, and the balance of that with qualitative data in our world, and kind of going a little bit deeper in ways. So I think that's a huge thing that relates a little bit to Jim's question, and is something that we're grappling with in our environment.
Thank you. I think also, to get to Jim's question, it would be fascinating to get some people from other museums engaged in similar pursuits, such as yours. For instance, I was just in New York at the Museum of Natural History, and I noticed they were doing much the same type of data collection. And I think that there's much knowledge to be gained from what happens when you start comparing across institutions. So again, some very interesting possibilities and questions opening up on the horizon. Jeffrey, thoughts from your end?
Well, again, to kind of continue the discussion around Jim's question, I think with these online courses, the MOOCs, we will see a lot of data gathered as a result of that. Basically, every mouse movement and keystroke and interaction with these systems is being logged, along with how the students are performing. And so and if you look at the founders of for example, Coursera, Andrew Ng and Daphne Kohler, they're both people that are heavily involved in data analytics, and I'm sure that we will see from their efforts and efforts of these other programs, learning that is tailored to particular learning styles of individuals that will be much more successful over time in helping people learn. And I think this will be a great benefit to society. And I think it's happening, from K through 12, through higher education, through post-institutional learning, adult learning, and it will be a big benefit.
Thank you. So, David, closing thoughts on your end, or something you'd like to expand, or if you spotted a question you'd like to address?
Well, I have to agree with. It's easy for me to sort of fall in love with Nicole's answer, because the other aspect of this is what I would call the soft data, the qualitative questions, and so I think there's going to be this artful balance that's going to have to get walked. This journey is going to have to look between, what is the big data, what are the new questions that we can pursue, but how qualitatively does it change our practice? And so this one other system that we're looking at here at our school is called the Folio Collaborative. And the Folio Collaborative is what I call a soft data process around improving pedagogy and a really generative approach to it. And there's some small big data aspects that can be reflective and helpful. But what I actually think is going to be the other side of this equation is how do you measure big data against the soft data, and like how institutionally are we pursuing that together? How are we pursuing that as teachers and educators in the K through 12 arena?
Excellent, thank you. And I think you've brought up several important points. I think also in some ways your answer relates in ways to Patricia's question about maybe in school big data can improve learning analysis and can be used instead of tests. This gets to some very interesting questions, because then it allows us to say, well, hold on, what's the role of a test? What's the role of assessment? Can we look at assessment as something separate from a test, and maybe what we're doing with the test can indeed go somewhere else, where the data, etc., can help us? It's a very interesting question. We tend to have always merged assessment with testing. We merge formative with summative functions, but perhaps there's opportunities here for disaggregating and reintegrating, as you're saying, soft with the quantitative data in interesting and new ways. So thank you. Jill, would you like to then close this out? I'll give you the floor then for your final thoughts, comments.
So I'm glad that we got to talk about education, and I think every institution is trying to figure out assessment and how to do it better, and we're not there yet. So when people say, can you give us great examples in education, those examples are just beginning, and I think there's not only figuring out what to do, but then how do you balance that with privacy is a really big deal. And so my hope is over the next 2 to 5 to 10 years that we figure out assessment in education and big data's place in that. There was a question about, or a comment that someone made about that our examples have been theoretical. There are lots of examples that aren't theoretical. They're all in business. And so if you take big data into a business context, those examples go back 10, 20, 30 years. That's not new. The area where we're all interested in is an area where big data is just starting to come into its own. And this is data in education, it's data in how our communities develop, it's data's use in libraries, it's data's use in on-the-ground advocacy. And those stories are still being written. Right now it is a bit of theory, a lot of practices that are just starting. And again, I think that as we get better at it, as we get more people doing it, as we figure out those things that we care about, yes, privacy is one of them, that real working examples, working illustrations will come to bear. But right now, we really have to turn to business for those examples that are fully fleshed out, things that are up and running, and that we can point to for their successes and their failures.
Thank you. I think that's a good note on which to wrap this up. I think you're absolutely right. I think business has the lead here, but I think also there's a huge world of opportunities, and I hope that listening to this discussion today has helped our audience realize the new scope, the new possibilities, and yes, the challenges also associated with this. So in closing, let me thank all 5 of you for a wonderful discussion today. I think we could go on for many more hours. It would be lovely, for instance, to delve deeper into technical aspects of each of your jobs and how you're using the tools and approaches you've discussed, and more details on how you're planning to use this. But I think what we've done today is set the stage for people to think, to explore, and hopefully see for themselves that, yes, it's worthwhile looking to the world that's opened up by big data. So with that, then, I want to thank also NMC for hosting this and turn it over to Holly for the final close. Holly?
Thank you so much, Dr. Pentadura. So to wrap up today's webinar. I want to thank our moderator, Dr. Ruben Pentadura, and the panelists, Aaron, David, Nicole, Jeffrey, and Jill, on behalf of the NMC, for taking the time to present their take on big data in various sectors. So participants, if you're wanting more information or anything about what you saw or heard today, let us know. You can contact me directly at holly@nmc.org. And also, if you want to learn more about future NMC on the Horizon programs and get involved in our community, please visit our website at nmc.org, like us on Facebook or friend us on Twitter. We're all over the social media universe. And please save the date for our next On the Horizon, December 4th, noon Central, where we're going to be having Coven Smith, the Director of Technology at Denver Art Museum, moderate a discussion on preservation and conservation technologies. So thank you, everyone. It was a full hour, and we'll see you next time.